Matthew, fantastic to get you on Real Vision. I've been looking forward to this.
Me too.
So I'd love people to know a bit of your background, and then we're going to take them a bit of a journey because there's a place in the future we need to take them to. But let's start in the past. How did you get into what you're doing? What's your background?
Sure. I've always been fascinated by really tough problems, especially as pertains to what's around the corner in consumer digital, consumer media, and leisure at large. In the late 2000s, early 2010s, I was predominantly focused on the mobile app economy and to a lesser extent, how the major media companies had to transform their business models, their delivery, their tech stack, their incentives, organizations to take advantage of the internet, the mobile internet, and so forth. Subsequent to that, I went to work for Peter Chernin at the Chernin Group. He had raised several $100 million to build, buy, develop, scale companies that were taking advantage of exactly that opportunity. We invested in Twitter, Medium, Pandora, SoundCloud, purchased majority stakes in companies such as Crunchyroll, Barstool Sports. We also helped found a number of companies such as Reese Witherspoon's most recent exit, which is Hello Sunshine. And then my expertise in digital video, which was really a focal point of the Chernin Group, brought me to Amazon. I was the first head of strategy for Amazon Studios, which at the time ran all of Prime Video. And I was brought in to oversee the majority of content investments, that was TV and film, licensed and original, domestic and international, as well as investments not just in individual titles, but our supplier relationships, our talent deals. I left in early 2018 to raise a small amount of capital to invest in what I saw to be the next hard problem. Even as early as 2017, 2018, as we started heading into the streaming wars, digital video seemed to be a bit of a solved problem. That isn't to say that we knew who was going to win or what the margins would look like, but the roadmap to launch an SVOD or subscription video on demand service, the strategies that were required to win, and even some of the programming that was most successful started to sort itself out. What was clear at the time was that gaming was going to become the new frontier for culture, for investments at the venture level, and then also just in determining what's around the corner for culture at large. So I raised some capital, joined some startups, and that in turn led me to the topic du jour, which is the metaverse.
So your story has really been one of the kind of media business and its many manifestations, I guess. Because, having come through this journey myself, I actually came through the crypto journey and the finance journey, but then started Real Vision 2014 because I realized I was in the UK at the time. So I was living in Spain. A friend of mine was running ITV, which was the largest independent television company. And I said, how's business? This was 2007. I said, how's business? He goes, great. He said, I'm a bit worried about YouTube. I said, but it's cat videos. He said, we pay £100 million for a broadcasting license, and now nobody needs one. And that sat with me for a while, and eventually started Real Vision based on that premise that basically anybody could compete in that market, and that whole content market has changed. But I think what you've noticed is yet again the whole space is changing, and there's, I think, an enormous amount of change. I think streaming wars was small in comparison to the change that's just coming. So let's talk a bit about what you see as the metaverse now. And then we'll start digging into a whole bunch of areas and who the players are, how this is going to evolve. But when you started this journey, and I've been reading your blog, some of your journey of understanding and the 9-part kind of introduction that even Mark Zuckerberg referenced, I think, last week. What is it that caught your attention? You saw games and then suddenly you saw something else. How?
Right. Well, I think it helps to really put the metaverse in context from a...
What is it that caught your attention? You saw games and then suddenly you saw something else. How?
Right. Well, I think it helps to really put the metaverse in context from a technological, behavioral, and also just an economic perspective. What is getting big tech and society at large so excited about the metaverse as both a buzzword, but also an area of interest, is this idea that we're seeing a generational evolution of the internet. You'll note that in Mark's unveiling of their metaverse strategy, he defined it in a similar way that I conceive of the metaverse, which is a successor state to the mobile internet. Well, as your audience certainly understands, but even most people understand today, the advent of the internet and then the advancement of the mobile internet led to extraordinary change. Not just in the companies we patron and the devices that we use, but the very nature of longstanding industries. If you take a look at two categories that are really simple to understand, you can take a look at telecommunications. Skype emerges, ICQ emerge in the 1990s. Then we get to the mobile internet, and yet again, we see telecommunications disrupted. Snapchat and WhatsApp. We get to the late 2010s, where we start to get into this early metaverse transformation. Communication services are disrupted yet again, primarily through social networks in gaming like Fortnite, but more importantly from Discord and others. Another great category would be in payments. You look at the emergence of PayPal in the 90s, its growth throughout the 2000s. Then, of course, you reach the mobile internet era, and it happens again. We get Square, we get Stripe, we get Shopify, we get Venmo. And now we're starting to get to cryptocurrencies, as you well know, and they start to transition into the metaverse. And so at a baseline level, the excitement for me is we're seeing this multi-decade transformation that is really starting to begin right now, in which we expect most categories to be opened right up, and yet our ability to precisely understand which companies are at risk, which models are yet to emerge, what the behaviors that support each of those companies will be, that's an open question. For investors, that's opportunity. For analysts, that's intellectual curiosity. And for consumers, it's an enormous opportunity for new benefit, for new experiences. As relates to my journey in gaming, look, the fantastic thing here is no one really expected, as a case in point, that the next generation of the internet would come from mobile gaming, and yet here we are. And yet, to that same token, I don't think that many people thought that the most powerful companies of the social or Web 2 era were going to come in one instance from a sexting application, in another instance from a hot or not turned collegiate fraternizing social service. In this instance, it happens that it's coming from a virtual sandbox for kids in Roblox. It is coming from a battle bus battle royale in Fortnite. And even as we see right now, the memification of NFTs has elements of speculation. There's going to be elements that lead nowhere. And yet it's very clear that it is pioneering structural change in our economy.
I mean, I never forget, I had that kind of metaverse holy shit moment when I was seeing a friend of mine in England, and it was a Saturday afternoon, and I was having lunch with him at his house. And his son was 15, and he'd just come in from outside, and he sat down in a gaming chair in front of this huge TV, put on a microphone on, and started chatting. And we were having a kind of glass of wine, and I'm like, what's he doing Saturday afternoon? Why is he not out with his friends? He goes, he is with his friends. He played football this morning, but now he's chatting to his friends. I said, how? He goes, well, they kind of live in Fortnite together. And he said, what's interesting is it's not only his friends from the neighborhood, it's the guy he met on holiday in the US 2 years ago, some friends he met in Spain, and all of this, and they're all hanging out together, and they live here. And he goes and he's buying stuff and trading stuff. And that was the moment I realized that there was a generational gap, that I sort of grew up with games, but not in the same way. But this is where people were living now. And it kind of made total sense to me. And then you start to see that, for me, it's seeing that everything I've been looking at, both in the financial world and the macro world, the technological kind of exponential age that I've been talking about, plus crypto, they've all kind of met. But its future state is the metaverse. And you try and get people's head around this, and they still kind of, their brain melts, because there's a lot of pushback, is we don't want to live like this. So I think, just to give people a bit of foundation as we talk through this, talk a bit about the difference between the metaverse, the difference and where they combine the metaverse, virtual reality, and augmented reality, because these things are all hurtling together at a frightening pace from different players as well.
Totally. I think I'm of the belief that extended or mixed reality, XR, AR, VR, are better understood as parts of the metaverse, much like we would consider the mobile phone, a connected television, an internet-equipped car to be extensions of the internet or the mobile internet. They are not the mobile internet itself. It's helpful to think about XR as part of the metaverse because it's the most distinctively different and new
When you
thing.
say XR, what do you mean?
Extended reality or mixed reality, as others mean. But it's a good catch-all term for virtual reality in which you're inside of a dedicated headset and you're receiving no other visual information from the world around you.
My Oculus Rift is that.
Correct. Yes.
Okay.
Then you have augmented reality, which, as the name suggests, you are seeing the real world, but you are layering in additional information. Others start to talk about more extended reality devices, which is more just thinking about the ways in which any device you have interacts with the world around you. I'll give two examples. Apple is now putting a type of chip into newer iPhones and Apple Watches that are capable of putting out 500 million radar pings per second. What that allows your devices to do is have precise understanding of the environment around you and then activate it. So we have this situation where today with an NFC chip, let's say you want to open your door in your home. Someone's come. Well, you come close to the door and then the door either requires you to physically touch it or you need to come so close that it doesn't know if you're on one side of the door or the other side or what your intent is. So you have these terrible outcomes, which is you walk by your door and you've unlocked it. With these pulses, there's a degree of precision in information that can be mixed with AI to understand intent, to correlate with other sensory information, which is a Ring doorbell, to know that Matt's on this side of the door, Matt intends to open the door, and similarly, to understand exactly where that door is relative to your device in a way that cumbersome technologies like Bluetooth and RFID or NFC cannot today. And so we also talk about extended reality in the sense of all the devices around us with advanced sensors, AI, computer vision interconnecting, if that makes sense.
I've also heard that Apple is building out a augmented reality map of the world. And it sounds like if your devices can ping at such a rapid rate, you're basically going to create a sonar vision of the entire world, including everybody's house and everything. That's probably where it's going, right? So they build out an entire digital representation of everything.
Yeah, that's quite right. I mean, one of the most exciting problems that we face when we're talking about the metaverse is how do you construct it? The information required to create virtual twins, to create an extended simulation, which is really at core what we're talking about, is extraordinary. And so the more devices that we have that are passively capturing information, we can talk about the security risks or the privacy risks, but is a huge leap there. But the advancements and the implications are profound. I mean, one great example here is just imagine being in your home wearing a VR headset. I'm going to use this as a tail example, but you can understand the context. If your VR headset is able to understand, Matt, you're about to walk into your coffee table, then guess what? You no longer need a dedicated VR room, which most people don't have the space for and able to participate. This sort of contextual awareness helps to generate the virtual world. It helps to augment use cases like opening a door, but it also allows you to immerse yourself in ways that aren't practical if you don't have a basketball court to spare.
Okay, well, let's talk about that other issue, which is the same issue that I have with my Google Nest at home. Is Google are not in the business of controlling my home temperature. They're in the business of collecting the data of when I'm at home, where I am, in what room I am. Because the first thing I do when I get home is put my phone down, right? And Nest actually then tracks where you are in the house. We're giving these companies extraordinary amounts of data and power. How do we get around that? I mean, do I have a ability to say, well, Matt's arriving at my front door, I'm going to let him have the augmented map of my house because he's coming in? Do I get that choice? Or do we just lose all of our privacy, including where we are at any one time?
So this is one of the most important questions. I'm often asked, what's the downside from the metaverse? And I think the biggest challenge relates to the fact that three of the most important questions, or four, of the social era or the Web 2.0 era haven't been solved yet, which is what's the appropriate degree of platform power? How do we avoid misinformation? How do we protect data securely? And then, of course, is just this core question of data rights, not just who owns data, but how is data used? How are you made aware of the usage of that data? The biggest challenge as we look to the metaverse is we don't have good answers for any of those four questions. And yet the expectation of the metaverse essentially exacerbates all of them, because we are talking about shifting more of our time, our energy, our leisure, our labor, our wealth, and certainly our most important data into a virtual environment. That elevates the question you just asked. There's no good answer, but I do think that this inherently dovetails into the question around blockchain and why there's so much enthusiasm here.
Exactly right, because the way to have permissioned access to data that is secure seems at the very epicenter of this, because without it, it doesn't really work. It becomes quite dystopian. But with it, it becomes manageable, potentially.
Right. And I think you can break that down in two ways. Number one is we have already found that once you equip a given closed platform with a certain amount of information, it is almost impossible to wrest yourself from it, just as it is difficult for a competitor to compete with that company. A good example, a simple example, is who owns your search history on Amazon, your purchasing history. That information could certainly be used to augment your shopping experience on Walmart, and yet Amazon has no incentive to provide it, and therefore Walmart cannot avail themselves of it. And as a result, as an Amazon customer, you potentially face elevated pricing. The second question is just this core, almost human question, which is who actually has the right to capture that data in the first place? Not just keep it, not just not share it, and not just the feedback loops to the extant platform, but if we need to live in the virtual world, much like we need mobile phones today, do we want to end up in an environment where that requires us to constantly surface and give up forever the core of our digital identity? I think in blockchain, there's enthusiasm because there's this question of what you expose, when you expose it, and who retains ownership of that information after the interaction has concluded. I think we can all admit that in an environment in which you don't need to trust intentions, you don't need to give something up forever, you don't have to rely on Congress to eventually figure out how to regulate an industry a decade later in a way that is economically and precedentially appropriate. None of that sounds like an ideal outcome.
So I want to talk a bit about Apple and Facebook before we move into some other areas. So what else is Apple doing here? Because it's dawned on me recently that this is their big play. The next big play is this augmented reality. What are you perceiving that Apple's role in this is going to be?
So you can think of Apple's role in two primary ways. Number one is to understand that as the dominant access path or gate to the internet and the mobile internet, they have extraordinary hard, soft, and accidental power. The policies that they enforce, the takes that they collect, the technologies that they allowed, the standards and protocols in which they support or do not, fundamentally shapes the development of the entire rest of the metaverse ecosystem. Tim Sweeney, the founder and CEO of Epic Games, has said outright that Apple has outlawed the metaverse. Potentially relevant applications, whether that is dApps or cloud gaming, have been fundamentally stymied, altered, or constrained by Apple based on its own preferences, some of which we can take as honestly user-intentioned. Others are perhaps a little bit more self-dealing. And so the first way to understand Apple is just in that regard, how it, through what it does or doesn't do, affects what everyone else can or cannot do. The second element is to understand the ways in which Apple seems likely to advantage themselves of those benefits to dominate in the metaverse. Mark Zuckerberg has said that the greatest technological challenge of our time is fitting a supercomputer into a wearable piece of glasses. I would debate whether or not that is truly the greatest technological challenge of our time, but the difficulty in getting a complex GPU, a battery, a mobile chip at all into a headset is extraordinarily difficult. It's particularly hard for Facebook because Facebook wants this to be a standalone hardware device that does not require anything else. Why? Because if it requires something else, then the thing it's dependent on, like a mobile phone, an iPhone, an Android, governs them like they do today. Apple gates what a Facebook AR device could do through its APIs and driver and app store policies. The challenge, however, is Facebook therefore needs to build a standalone piece of hardware, whereas Apple can do what they do with an Apple Watch, which is treat your iPhone as an edge server for your extended reality devices. Your headset does not need a dedicated mobile chip. Your headset does not need a highly capable GPU because it can instead connect to your iPhone in your pocket, which costs $1,000, and then ride off its compute, off its data, off its connectivity in much the same way your Apple Watch likely does. And so Apple looks at this as an area where their existing advantages, plus the ways in which they can adversely affect everyone who wants to build off their device, plus the ways in which using their device allows them to have a cheaper, smaller, and probably better AR device, positions them as the best player to participate in any virtual, extended, or augmented reality future.
So even if they define that world, they're going to be winners in it just by case of their monopoly, essentially. It's very hard for them at this stage to be unseated. Facebook, as you said, has the one weakness, but it has some other benefits too, which is 3.5 billion people on a network.
Right. Mm-hmm.
They're just introducing a system of money, which I think of both as a stable coin, but also as a social token, and you've basically created a nation state because they have all the elements of a nation state now because they have a set of rules, they have a mission, they have money, all of the things that organize complex adaptive societies. It's clear that Mark Zuckerberg is absolutely 100% focused on this. Well, everybody else is arguing about Facebook and data and everything else. Facebook is like, we've got 10,000 people working on virtual reality in the metaverse. It kind of feels that platforms are going to disappear as we understand them. Websites are going to disappear. It all gets eaten up by whatever's coming. What's Facebook's role, you think, in this? Because again, it makes people nervous, but also excited as well.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. As you know, as technological cycles change and mature, different premises wax or wane, we see that the advantages of a given asset in turn change. The premise of the metaverse is so strongly correlated around an interoperable, almost universal identity, related data, and related entitlements, in this instance, virtual entitlements, the things that you've purchased, the things that you've been granted access to, that Facebook as the dominant identity platform globally, plus the dominant social graph, seems incredibly well positioned. We can juxtapose that with extraordinary investments in VR. It's truly difficult to express how significant that is. It is not just the fact they have 10,000 engineers right now. It's not just the fact that Mark Zuckerberg has committed the company to solving this problem. It's that for roughly 4 years, they were the only ones investing in it. They basically said, in a brilliant example of founder conviction and ability, resources, and commitment, was the one who said, you can all stop investing, I'm not going to. And so we look at all of this, and there's an extraordinary advantage there. Now, I think where many are suspicious of Zuckerberg's outcome really relates to the purpose of the metaverse in the first place. I think we take for granted that the origination of the internet was predominantly designed around collaboration. And not only was it designed around collaboration, it was from nonprofit, technological enthusiasts, and public research institutions. The goal was so that I could share a file with another researcher, and so that the government could talk from one destination to another destination. It was not designed to collect data. It was not designed to sell things. It was not designed to place advertisements. Irrespective of which company pioneers this future, there's going to be a commercial purpose. And if we've learned anything from 40 years of the internet, it's that understanding the ricochet consequences of a technological innovation is really hard, really hard. And yet we can nevertheless say, well, if the baseline purpose is data collection or ads or selling things or controlling your billing relationships, the ricochets are probably not favorable.
Yeah, it's when Mark Zuckerberg came out and really revealed his metaverse strategy, a lot of people got scared of a metaverse where somebody has such a big advantage, which is their investment in VR plus the network and a system of money, to be fair. Those three things together make it hugely powerful and difficult to deal with. The question is how interoperable they want to make their world and how open. Because Facebook has a history, as does Apple, of opening up, saying, sure, come and play in our playing field, and then restricting the rules, and the rules restrict more and more and more, and basically you've rescinded control to Facebook. People are nervous of that. I mean, if they weren't, it's a no-brainer because it would scale so fast. Mm-hmm. But there's this one element. How do you think through that one element? Is who's going to play fair in the end?
Yeah, I think the challenge is we have this arc where every technologist is very pro-openness, partly because they understand it from a purity perspective. They don't have quarterly earnings. And then they themselves benefit from that openness in order to build up their company, and then they progressively close. There are a few examples of companies that have progressively closed, gotten around, and then started to come back around to openness. Brad Smith, the president of Microsoft, has said publicly, we were on the wrong side of history with open source. Now we have Mark Zuckerberg opened, right? There was a time in which you could publish an Instagram post to Twitter, then closed, and now is trying to get back open. A skeptic or cynic's perspective would say, well, Microsoft, that's because you lost to Apple, and now you want the advantage of openness again. You would prefer a closed mobile ecosystem if you owned it. Others say to Facebook, you prefer openness because you feel so stymied by the mobile platforms who surpassed you in market cap and in revenue, which is probably true too. And so it's hard to take a read on that. It is certainly true that in order to gain adoption, a platform like Facebook needs developers en masse. In addition, they have a weaker history with developers and with policies, and so they have to be particularly forthright and probably committed over the medium term to earn those developers over time. Yet none of this ever overcomes that natural tendency towards closure over time. You build up a network so that you can advantage yourself of network effects, and then you don't want those network effects to then let your competitors hyperscale as quickly. And so again, this is where we get into the differences Chris Dixon talks about it between a Web 2.0 thesis being don't be evil and a crypto-based future, which is can't be evil, which is this idea that when you're building off of key blockchain protocols, you don't have nearly the same tools through which you can become a $500 billion company by 2025 and then say, sorry, community, that's done. We're shutting it down. We no longer want to participate. Google did one of the scariest things that I think is a precedent for crypto going forward, which is when they started Android, it was truly open. Not just open in terms of user permissions for sideloading, for using alternative billing, but they supported something called the Open Handset Alliance. This was a joint venture of sorts or consortium where all of the original equipment manufacturers could co-develop Android. Eventually, Google said, you can keep contributing to OHA, but if you want your version of Android to have Google's Play Store and Google's apps, which is effectively a requirement, you have to use our shade. And so it's like saying, look, you can come into every door to our club, but if you don't come through the main door, you can't get a drink and you can't dance. And what we're hopeful for from a crypto perspective is that behavior is just not possible. There will be some curbing, of course. Some of these companies will advantage themselves of crypto's ethos and then launch new products, shovel their customers from the crypto to non-crypto experiences and use that to corner the market. But it's just not going to be possible as it was with Android, as it was with the open web, as it was with mobile.
Okay, so quickly want to cover Google as well. Where the hell are they in this? Or are they just going after AI and are they going to a different world? Or are they part of this arms race?
They're certainly part of this arms race. I mean, if you take a look at all of the major tech companies, it's impossible to separate any of them from the metaverse just because the metaverse is so wide-ranging. Google, of course, has more active user accounts on the internet through its Android platform than anyone else. They do have the third largest cloud computing business. They have myriad other devices in the home. They have several UGC platforms. And most importantly, Google owns, controls, or influences many of the de facto and actual standards globally. That provides incredible soft power. It is like arguing that the people who influence trade policy aren't actually the ones building something that's shipped from country to country. To just equate the latter with power is to misunderstand the role of influence. But more importantly, Google, too, is not unaware of what this future looks like. They have invested extensively in dark fiber, in virtualization, in cloud computing, in extended reality devices. I would not say that a clear strategy exists today. I would not say that they have the most intuitive set of assets compared to a Facebook, Apple, or even Amazon, but they're doubtlessly going to be working towards this.
And the other one, I spoke to, funnily enough, talking about this stuff a lot on Real Vision and elsewhere, somebody reached out to me and said, I'd love to chat to you about it. I think I can help your thinking. And the guy who runs the Metaverse at AWS, and they've got 350 people working on improving the computational power for all of this to happen. So it's kind of everybody's working. And it's quite funny because when I first kind of talked about this publicly with Pierce Kicks, everyone's like, oh my God, what is all of this? And the more work you do on it, the more you realize actually it's much closer than you think, and it's much closer at scale than you think, because Google, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, they're all players in this. The player that is the people's champion right now, and this might change in due course, is Epic Games and Tim Sweeney. Talk me through the rise of them and where he wants to go to with this, because he's got a different vision than the others so far.
Yes. So look, let's start by talking about why it is that games and game engines have started to become at the forefront of the metaverse. And I would extend this, frankly, into any of the major crypto projects. You talk about Bored Apes, CryptoPunks, Axie Infinity, everything that's happening at Dapper Labs. Like, it's very clear that games are at the centerpiece here. And so let's talk about why, because that will explain why Epic Games has found itself at this opportunity. There's really two different streams. One is to say that the metaverse is best understood as the shift of computing and interaction from a device in your pocket into a virtual simulation. Well, it turns out that for 40 years now, the most complex consumer-grade simulations have been built in gaming because almost nothing else required that degree of simulation. Everything else was either so purpose-specific, such as the Avengers fighting Thanos, or so non-requiring of physics, such as making a backdrop in, the Lord of the Rings film, that no one invested deeply in physics. And in fact, games are so powerful because they're not prioritizing visual fidelity, which was the aspiration of Hollywood with computer rendering, the aspiration of a architectural firm in rendering, but on fun and unpredictability, which meant that you were investing not just in the capabilities for simulation, but the extensibility of that simulation, right? I'm going to throw a grenade at you. And it's not just that has to simulate a grenade, but it has to understand the cross consequence of that grenade. And so if the metaverse is best understood from a position of simulation, game engines happen to be best in the world at that, even though they were made for toyetic purposes for decades. The second thing to understand is what is required to onboard someone into a virtual world. It's not altogether dissimilar to get to our earlier conversation about hot or not on Facebook, which is fun. And separate from that fact, the way that the games industry worked was unique from other entertainment mediums, which was that it depended on incentives. YouTube has to entertain you. A video game has to incentivize active behavior. And so we have this situation where games companies have the tools for complex simulation and rendering. They've designed themselves to be fun, which I think many of us coming out of the Web 2 era would say, yeah, we love social networks A, B, and C. We don't feel good about using them. That is not something endemic to video games. And three, they're incredibly powerful at incentivization, another area in which crypto has shown itself to be very effective. This has brought all of these companies that previously were unknown, marginalized, not seen to be as important when it came to CBS or to the Walt Disney Company, and suddenly elevated them to the top. Tim Sweeney has this advantage of the assets required to pioneer in the metaverse, but also a deeply 80s and 90s technologist perspective. He, at least thus far, has shown and expressed his power and his disposition and his philosophy in decisions that advance an open metaverse. Almost everything that they develop and release is as untethered as possible. We are used to a world in which, hey, if you want service A, you have to take B through E. And if you don't want all of them, we're going to charge you 4 times as much. Does not do that. We also see another instance in which every time they make an acquisition, they cut the fees that they take to developers. That is as anti-Apple in philosophy as one can imagine. And it is ultimately then tied to what I mentioned before, which is we're going to make your business more profitable, and we're actually going to unwind the sticky cross requirements that would keep you our customer. We can debate why they'd want to do that, but from a philosophical perspective, that is as close to the idealistic foundation for the metaverse as we could hope for.
I struggle to see a world in which Epic Games is not $1 trillion company if they get this right. Because if they get it right, it has network effects, unlike Apple does, because Apple has to create its own network effect because you can't really build on it as much. They own too much of it. But Epic Games could do that. Because if their Unreal Engine and a bunch of other things allow the development of a metaverse in ways that they don't control and don't care, they win the whole game in an open way, which is encouraging. And how that meets Facebook in this is going to be fascinating. To me, it feels like we're building digital sovereign states. And what we're doing here at this level of the metaverse, and those states will have a different set of freedoms, as states do. And we will be able to occupy the states in which give us the best advantage to live in digitally. It's extraordinary the power that these companies are going to have in the end of all of this.
Yeah, I mean, look, Tim Sweeney has said publicly that if one company controls the metaverse, they will be more powerful than any company in human history. He has said they will be like a god on earth. Jensen Huang, the NVIDIA founder and CEO, has said that he believes the metaverse economy will exceed the entire economy of the real world today. Whether or not he's off by 50% or 75%, it's immaterial. We're talking about extraordinary value. The difference here is it is not possible, even for a government, to truly operate as police, as Mother Nature, as customs. They can't define the physics of the real world, the unit of measurement, what you do, who you talk to. They can't flip a switch to end this conversation, even if they wanted to. And so we're talking about a world in which if a company does that, their ability to collect everywhere would be unmatched. We're already seeing this with Apple, and yet Apple is still mostly just touching the in-app economy, not the real world economy. I think that's one of the motivators for someone like Tim Sweeney, that understanding, the belief in the 90s philosophy of the internet, and the greatest understanding of what the future state looks like and what happens if we end up with a different outcome. And I think we're fortunate to have that philosophy put to work with a company that has the momentum, the access to cash, and the product to actually affect change.
One of the things that I've thought, and you mentioned it as well in reference to NVIDIA, how I get my head around this is I think this is discovering the Americas. It's like it's an entire new GDP that doesn't exist. So it's an extraordinary change for the world because now the world is infinitely scalable. And that's something people don't get their heads around. There are no finite resources unless somebody within a metaverse defines that something is a finite resource. Bitcoin, for example. So we have this new world of which we can walk into and create economies from, whether it's a personal economy for you and I, or whether it's a business, or whether it's a large chunk of the metaverse. And this is GDP that didn't exist before. And if we think about the world where humans are being replaced by robots and AI, it gives us a potential sense of purpose to create new opportunity in new lands, which is the metaverse.
I think one of the most important changes that explains why the metaverse has become such a bon mot, so to speak, relates to the way in which virtual worlds have been destigmatized as a result of COVID in a truly unique way. If you go back to 2018, yes, people understood and appreciated video games, but it was not considered to be an aspirational behavior. There was not an expectation that that was a good use of your time. It was a backstop for rain, for being stuck at home. It was not seen as a place in which you could be economically productive. It was not seen as a place in which your social signaling and your achievements had any superiority versus alternatives. COVID has legitimized time in virtual worlds in a way that almost no other event could have. Obviously, there was tragedy. But as part of that, that destigmatization, which is taking judgment and shifting that perspective to acceptance, has also shown what a new medium for expression it can be. It's not just an Americas in that it's more real estate. It's a new canvas for individuals. In some instances, it enables individuals to participate in a way they couldn't before. That's a geographic limitation. In other instances, it enables those of us who don't have the same degree of comfort in our personal identity, our visuals, or we just suffer from physical ailments and social disorder to now participate. But more importantly, and this is where we get into the new Americas, it's a little bit more like discovering the solar system, the galaxy. It's a place where nothing has to be tethered to reality in a traditional way. And don't want to argue that that means that our future is running around like a T-Rex crossed with a banana, shooting guns at one another in this Wall-E dystopian utopia. But it's instead just to say that it's a new place where we can build in a way that is tethered to no reality and no physics that we've ever had before. This is also why sometimes you see this idea that it's a digital theme park. And I think the thing that's so compelling here is humans love art. We spend most of our time pursuing leisure. And yet the art that we typically consume is video. It's about 75% of all leisure time in the United States. And the art form of video is relatively constrained. You start to talk about the advancement of a new medium in the metaverse that has no artistic constraints. Almost every variable you can play with that's live, that's interactive, that is social, the extensions are manifold.
So I've talked about crypto in the past as being a supermassive black hole, and we're seeing, how money is being attracted to the space from the returns and then the technology and the possibilities. But the metaverse is a bigger black hole that it's hard. I try not to focus on too much for people because it's difficult for them to understand. But everything, and this is where I want to get where you think this is all going. But from what I can understand now, there is almost no point having education outside of the metaverse because it's easier, more accessible, cheaper, scalable. So a kid in Ethiopia can attend Harvard and he can afford to do it on a same level playing field. Also, because of avatars, you get rid of racism and all the stupid things about who's black, who's white, who's a woman, who's not, because nobody cares in the digital world. It kind of stops all of that. So you get some sort of equality, which is interesting. I think all media goes this way. Obviously, I haven't told everybody at Real Vision, but I've already just built a headquarters in Crypto Voxels just to start it and just, get a feel for it. So, we've got this beautiful NFT gallery with Mad Dog Jones exhibiting stuff and Micah Johnson and all sorts of stuff going on in there just because I want to get involved. But that's the end of websites, because when somebody gives you a Crypto Voxels coordinate, you're like, well, why do I ever need a website again? Because I can go straight into the metaverse. And then we talked about the end of platforms because, well, why? I can create my own platform. I can create a Raoul's world where my Twitter feed is there and my Real Vision feed is there and my Bloomberg screen is there and it's all my world. So I create my own platform. So that feels like that kind of goes. Gaming and the leisure time, that seems to be happening. As we've seen from Axie Infinity and many others, people are now earning an income there as well. They're creating digital assets and trading digital assets and getting economic benefits. So this is happening super fast. Where do you think this all ends up? Because it feels like, as you said, it's like, okay, discovering the galaxy or the universe. Christ, well, everybody wants to go there because it's infinite money.
So I think there are two important frames of reference. One is to take a look at how wrong we typically are about these broad perspectives of the future. I always use the example. If you go to the 90s, people talk about the information superhighway. They talk about the World Wide Web. Neither of those were particularly helpful frameworks for the future. And to the extent in which we had more narrow theses, such as the future is user-generated content, it is digital transactions, it is online entertainment, that certainly did not cleanly lead us to TikTok. It didn't cleanly lead us to Bitcoin. It didn't cleanly lead us towards Fortnite or Roblox. We can understand that the future is virtual existence, virtual simulation, virtual time, leisure, labor, what have you. Actually understanding the second and third and fourth order consequences is the challenge. It's the opportunity for investors, but in particular, it's the fun part. I think the second way to understand that is where I'm an optimist, which is I believe that it is going to transform some of the areas in which futurists and pundits have long speculated the industry would reach or the internet would reach, but hasn't. Education is a great example you mentioned. We all understand the problems of geography-specific education. We all understand that super teachers, 10x, 100x teachers are some of the most important resources in the world, and yet we get almost no leverage from them. Remote education was believed to be that opportunity, and yet we learned during COVID that Zoom school is awful. Well, once you have a teacher that is in a virtual world, who has a sense of presence. And by the way, that presence can be duplicated infinitely. A single teacher could be instructing 10 million kids in 150,000 concurrent simulations, equipped by a one-to-one simulator or instructor as part of that. But they're not just in an environment that has a sense of presence that you can touch and feel and look at a student, no matter where they are, but you can avail yourselves of tools that aren't available in the classroom. We're no longer talking about baking soda and vinegar volcanoes. We are talking about a literal volcano, one that you can interrogate, that you can agitate, that you can understand at a microscopic level. Everything we thought of as the magic school bus starts to become real. Epic and Roblox and Minecraft have these brilliant sessions that everyone should try, where you can learn about physics by constructing and investigating a Rube Goldberg machine. That is so much more potent than an instructor sitting here like you and I are talking about how motion works, force equals mass times acceleration. It is so much more compelling than one teacher talking to 18 or 500 students on a whiteboard. That, to me, the optimistic aspirational element, is where we say everything we thought the internet would do, should do, but didn't do starts to become possible.
And how does it stop being that teacher does 5 courses online, AI learns everything, and then that teacher's never needed again? How do we stop AI winning this entire game? I mean, that's part of the issue, right? Because at the end of all of this is that heavy presence of the singularity, whatever that means to different people. How does AI not take over this world? Because it is totally digital and it doesn't really need a human at all.
That's a good question. Look, there's the short and the long term. The long term is who knows. The short term is, why aren't I an AI? How didn't an AI figure out what the next phase of the internet would be and completely obviated the need for a Matthew Ball? NVIDIA just did a presentation at SIGGRAPH last week. The CEO was reproduced as an avatar. Almost no one noticed. And yet it was a 48-minute presentation and only 14 seconds were reproduced as a realistic avatar of himself. This is the CEO and founder of a $500 billion company, has access to more computing resources of high grade than anyone, including Andy Jassy. And yet they got less than 1/4 of a minute into a 48-minute presentation. I'm still pretty optimistic that if and when that opportunity comes, it's a long ways away. I tend to bet on human creativity, especially as relates to art. But I do think the extent in which we can start to supplement those experiences around a 100x teacher, and then maybe have to rely a little bit less on a 0.2x teacher, is what the advent starts to look like.
Yeah, I'm a cynical guy who comes from financial markets. Every trader got replaced. So every VC will be replaced. Everybody gets replaced in the end. The closer you are to the money, and financial traders in short-term markets were just generally AI for money making. So why not replace it with AI, which is what happened at scale. I mean, it was shocking what happened and how fast it happened. And everyone sat back, it's like, oh my God, I don't have a job anymore. So it kind of does, it's amazing how much that does happen. So let's talk about your investing just to wrap up now. So, okay, there's this gigantic change to the world of which most people get their heads around, which is great, which is your IP, right? Your IP is right. You think you understand where this is going. As you've clearly said, of course, you don't know where it's going, but you know the general direction you think. How do you invest in it? How are you finding parts of this? Because it's such a big thing. It's like, I'm going to invest in the solar system. Where the hell do you start?